Thanks everyone for joining. We're still seeing some people come in, so we're going to give it a few more minutes before we get started. It looks like we're still seeing people joining in on the webinar, so we'll give it another 2 minutes before we get started. Welcome everyone to the latest threat hunting webinar. The callback is coming from inside the house, from cybersecurity and Corelight. We're both big fans of the show, don't tell methodology. That is why in this webinar, we're not going to just define threat hunting. We'll talk to you about how you need visibility to do it and throw around a bunch of buzzwords. Instead, we've prepared an in-depth practical session that's going to demonstrate practical behavioral threat hunting and probably terrify a few CISOs out there. But before I get ahead of myself, we have some quick housekeeping that we want to get out of the way. First and foremost, if anyone has any questions throughout the webinar, please drop them into the chat section right away. We'll either respond directly or highlight your question during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. We want everyone to know that this webinar is being recorded, and on-demand version of this webinar will be made available to all registrants shortly after the conclusion. Additionally, feel free to check out some of the great resources available in the handout section as well as in the welcome message. Finally, there is a short 2-minute survey at the end of the webinar. We use these surveys to help us make great content that you guys want to see. We encourage everyone to fill it out, and everyone that fills it out will be entered into a drawing for a $100 Amazon gift card. Now with that out of the way, let's get into it. Let's do some quick introductions. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Richard Chit Chinamitri. I go by Chit. I'm a technology evangelist here at Corelight, and prior to Corelight, I actually worked as a senior security analyst with Edward Jones, and before that, I spent over a decade serving in the United States Navy, where I had the privilege of filling out a number of roles, including working with NSA's Tailored Access Operations team, as well as a Navy CMT and a Navy CPT. The other voice you'll be hearing today is Skylar Curtis. He's a senior security researcher and software engineer at Cyber Security. He also served with the United States Navy and the NSA as a systems administrator and digital network exploitation analyst. So let's dive into the scenario. So let's start with the story. Let's set the stage for our threat hunting scenario. For example, we'll be using a somewhat fictional dark fuzz ransomware gang. While this gang is fictional, it is based on several current ransomware operators that have used this technique. While this ransomware gang has used traditional methods like ransomware as a service, or RAS, for deploying its malware, it is recently starting a new method, insiders. They have offered people with inside access to large companies a payout of $500,000 US, just for giving them simple and nearly undetectable access to the environment. From there, the Dark Fuzz gang is going to go hands-on keyboard in the environment to stake out their targets of interest. Then they will begin exfiltrating data from the companies to their own infrastructure, but not before planting their malicious trick, a payload that is scheduled to detonate on October 31st. For our scenario, we'll be using the Acme Corporation. This is a massive multinational firm that does a little bit of everything, including offering managed services to its clients and to Wile E. Coyote. While this makes the Acme Corp a prime target for ransomware gangs, as it allows the Dark Fuzz gang to not only compromise Acme, but many of its clients as well. While the scenario is of course fictional, it is worth noting that this is a tactic that has been widely used by a few of the most capable ransomware gangs. Finally, let's talk about the cast for our scenario. Meet Edward Villinsider, aka Evil Insider. You can thank our marketing department for that clever name. Edward is a disgruntled system administrator for Acme Corp. Now, when we say disgruntled, we don't mean like the average person is in IT. No, we mean he's really, really disgruntled, and he has a bone to pick with Acme Corp. And it's been going on for years. That's when good old Eddie saw the Dark Fuzz ad promising a cool $500K just for following a few simple instructions. That was when Eddie reached out to the Dark Fuzz gang and offered his service for a price, of course, and that is where we come in. What we're going to show you is first how Edward and the Dark Fuzz gang will perpetrate their attack using the same tactics, techniques, and tools that other actors have used. Then we're going to demonstrate how organizations can hunt these type of attacks in their own environments on their own tools using endpoints and network data, and how combining these data sets can often have a force multiplying effect for security teams. And with that, let's get into the action. So let's talk about the heist. When we left our villain Evil Insider, he had a bone to pick with Acme Corp, and he reached out to the Dark Fuzz gang. The ransomware gang had asked Evil Insider to steal the SSH private keys from Putty, and he wanted them sent via Discord. Once Dark Fuzz received the key, they also sent Evil Insider a few simple commands to run in their environment. And with that, Evil Insider thought he had gotten away with it, if it wasn't for a fact that a tier 1 SOC analyst had noted something that was amiss. But as I mentioned before, we prefer to show and not tell. So let's do it live. And now we're going to get into the hands-on keyboard section. So I'm going to be playing today the tier 1 SOC analyst. my experience in the Navy has kind of gotten me to this point where, I'm going to look at data. I'm going to be able to search for data and say, what am I looking for? How am I looking for it? And what does it mean to me? So some of the tools that I use in my day-to-day is going to be things like Zeek. And Zeek was created in 1995 by Professor Vern Paxson, who is a co-founder here at Corelight. And you might ask, well, I have all this other good network data. Why Zeek? Well, Zeek is an open framework that is both a programming language and a scripting framework that analyzes network traffic and converts it into easy to digest ASCII logs. Because it's an open framework, it allows you to create new packages that can be scripts or protocol analyzers to either trip on interesting things like the MITRE Bazaar package, which is lateral movement techniques, or custom protocol analyzers like stuff that some of our people in the open source have created, like Amazon. And a good example of that is here in our GUI. So if everybody's reminiscent of what Zeek is, it was called Bro at one point. And what's nice is that Bro used to be a command line only style tool. It still is in the open source. However, with Corelight, we've actually made it easier for deployers and analysts to actually use it. So we talked about some of those things like protocol analyzers, as well as potential detection scripts like Eternal Safety or MITRE Bazaar. But then what's nice too is that you can create new analyzers or extend existing analyzers like HTTP post bodies. And what Corelight has done actually is provided new analytics that are Corelight only, like encrypted traffic insights. And this goes anywhere from detecting encrypted DNS servers to potentially looking at RDP or SSH inferences, meaning that even though they might be encrypted, you still have some interesting items that you can detect from that encrypted traffic. And then the latest one that we've released is C2, where we can actually start detecting things like potential DNS tunneling or even interpreter shells. And as I'm getting into it, Evil Insider has actually done some attacks, and it happened a little while ago, so I'm going to set my range for this time, for a few days ago. But what I'm going to do is, so far, I have something that is interesting in Suricata. Well, you might ask, what is good about Suricata? It's an IDS. It's, like Snort, and it's old. Well, you'd be right. However, Corelight actually introduced something really interesting in our product line. We've actually integrated Suricata directly into our sensors. And what's interesting about that integration is that we've actually added the unique identifier to those logs, meaning that if I do a search for the Suricata Corelight logs that are generated, I can actually link it to the unique identifier found in Zeek. And well, you might ask, well, that's great and all, but what does the UID do for me? Well, think of the UID as this unique identifier for each individual flow. If I use this individual flow to start pivoting into the logs, I can actually see what logs and flows are related. So as you saw before in my stats count by, these are Suricata alerts that are related to a single flow, meaning that if I wanted to, I'd have easy access to groupings to know which Suricata alerts are firing on individual flows. And then if it fires in the middle of a flow, I have the other logs like the Corelight connection log to tell me exactly what happened, how long it was, the duration, the underlying TCP protocols that were used, maybe the layer 7 information, and then the logs that were generated from it. But in this example today, Evil Insider gave SSH keys and he said, hey, I'm gonna do something. And well, I was unaware of this, but apparently I got a Suricata alert for PowerShell. So I'm gonna hunt for it and I'm gonna look for what is alerting just to make sure that what's happening is what I intend. So it looks like PowerShell Empire is being suspected here. So I'm gonna copy this information and then put it in my ticket because I don't think I have the chops necessary to really dive too deeply into this. And I have very limited access to endpoint technology, which is very important in this scenario. So I'm going to take this unique identifier. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to search all Zeek logs because I want to know what was generated from this traffic. And what's interesting is that I get a lot of events for this, right? And what's nice is that I can see what logs were generated. I can see that there's an HTTP log associated with this, and for the single flow happened 568 times. I can see that 404 alerts were generated because of Suricata, and the potential 51 files were translated between the two hosts. What's nice is that I can also see that maybe there are 2 notices that are generated. Maybe this is directly related to the Suricata alerts, maybe it's something else. But one thing that interests me is that I see 2 connections. Well, I see 2 connections, 2 connection logs. One is the regular con log, which tells you after a connection is closed, what is the duration and all those other interesting information. But I also have the connection log that's the long one. What that means is that, let's say that you have a long connection log and all of these other logs are generated during that flow. Well, because con log doesn't finish writing until it closes the connection, this con log actually keeps track of it as it goes on and tells you, hey, I have a long connection. This has exceeded the normal duration that most connections take. Well, the next thing I want to know is that, okay, who is this guy? So as I'm looking at this, I'm seeing potentially information around the con log. So I'm going to pivot to the con log, and I'm going to look at how long this connection was and what it looks like. So this is a very long connection. It looks like 2,853 seconds has gone by. It looks like it was talking to something external on port 80. It tells me that it was over HTTP, but this alert was what I triggered for PowerShell Empire. So maybe I should dive into the HTTP logs and see what's going on. But because I have this information, I'm going to let my tier 2 do a little bit more research around this because I want to know what this guy's talked to. So I'm going to do a quick search to see what potentially is happening on ARP. So one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the network traffic, and I'm going to look at that .12 that we saw, right? This .12 talking to 44, but I want to see who he's been talking to. So I'm going to look at what logs he's generated in the first place, because it tells me potentially what type of traffic this guy is seeing. So it looks like, based off of this time, I'm seeing that he's had lots of connections. You know, he's had a few long connections. He's done some DNS, which means he's probably surfed websites, and HTTP and SSL will probably tell me that. He's got some files transfer, so Corelight looks at the files in traffic, meaning that I don't have to do PCAP, collections to do some file carving. So that's nice. So I can see the metadata according to that. But what's interesting is I also have Meterpreter. I can log into this and see, okay, let's pivot to this Meterpreter log and see what's going on. And I could say, okay, there's probably a couple events. There's 2 events here that's going on. That 44.6. Oh man, this guy looks really strange. It's over 80.81, 80.81. Now that I have that, I also can pivot back to the flow that's related to it. But I'm going to start looking at what needs to happen. So I'm going to look at 2 things. This guy has really abnormal traffic. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to do a query on conlog only, looking for anything that he's originated to anything that's locally, and then I'm going to see who's responded to him. And the reason why I'm doing this is because my time at NSA, when I used to do exploitation, one of the things you want to do all the time as an exploiter is potentially looking at ARP cache and maybe clearing it out. So if my host guy goes and does a quick, ARP-A to see everything in the ARP table, he might be missing something. So this is something that I'm going to copy to my ticket now. I'm going to say, hey, it's talked to this guy, it's talked to these guys, and these are how weighted they are. Maybe these abnormal ones where they're small are the ones that might have gotten cleaned. The next step is something that's pretty unique to Zeek. And what I'm going to say unique-wise is that we talk about traffic, right? What's great about NetFlow? What's great about PCAP? NetFlow gives you a little record. It tells you usually it's network ops centric. It tells you, hey, I saw this packet go this way from this, host IP. It tells you who to talk to. It usually tells you like the quality state of that connection. Maybe it gives you some layer 7 information if it's V9. However, that's not good enough for me as a hunter. As somebody who's probably diving in and doing things, I want to know exactly what the nature of the connections are. And these 2 things that help me identify that are connection state and history. And there are 2 fields that identify the overall connection state, which tells me S0 is potentially connection seen, no replies, or start finish, or potentially, resets. What's nice is that we also break it down into the history, which tells you if it's TCP, UDP, or whether or not it went through the TCP handshake. Meaning that if I have a capital letter or lowercase letter, it tells me who sent the data. So capital letters is who initiated, lowercase is the responding side of the host or server, depending who starts. And then S means SYN, H means handshake, A means ACK, and then the D is data, meaning that I can identify data flow as it occurred, and whether or not potentially I had resets or other quality of life issues. Because I'm seeing this, I'm seeing potentially scanning attempts from this .12 to these IPs, because I see S0s, I see SYNs on the history, but I see that it's occurred 8,000 times in the past few days. So this is something that I'm going to also append to my ticket. So I'm going to copy all this information with my query and give that to my tier 2 analyst. The next thing I want to review is potentially maybe some interesting activity. And what I mean by interesting activity is potentially things that are in DNS. Maybe he's gone to a website that he's not supposed to. I do not know at this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a query. This first query is going to essentially look at DNS logs for this .12, and I'm just going to, filter out com, net, the top level domains, all the things that are, pretty common, including cert information, and I'm just going to do a quick search. And with this search, I should see on average what he's queried to, maybe potentially how often he's queried to something, and then maybe other outlying stuff. So I see, things that are indicative of potential net bios, and I can go into the DNS records to look at them. But what's interesting is that as I'm going through, some of these seem really normal, and I'm not too concerned about it. But this clickme.phishing domain seems abnormal. So I'm gonna copy paste that into my ticket now. But what's interesting is that I've also gotten a hint from him, because somebody in my policy management team says that somebody has been accessing something called Discord. And I don't know what Discord is, because I don't actually do anything with Discord. So what is Discord? Discord is a great chat program that's being used. So it's usually seen over HTTP or HTTPS traffic. So I'm going to look into the SSL log, because somebody from the DNS team said, hey, I found this DNS record, it resolved, and it's going to this, and it seems like he's been going to Discord for a while because it's been cached as of late. So I'm able to identify that he's going to discord.com, but then I can also say, well, what about other things like Discord? Let's just look at Discord in general. Well, I had those 2 events. Now I have 3 events. So outside of discord.com, he's going to something called discord.gg, and it looks like it's resolving to similar IP addresses. So I'm not too concerned. 34, 33. I need to add this to my list, because now this is something that's telling me a bit bigger of a story. So what I noticed too in his traffic is that he was using SSH. Well, he's a sysadmin, so SSH is normal for him. But I want to see what he's been accessing lately, because maybe he's been accessing things that he normally doesn't access. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to visit the Corelight SSH log, and I'm going to only look for traffic related to him and see what other stuff he's gone in contact with. So as I'm going through, this seems normal. He's using OpenSSH, he's using on his Ubuntu box, so I'm not too concerned. He's using 7.4, and that's fine. But there's a new section that Corelight has added called inferences. And what this is that it's inferences that tells you what is occurring on that connection. So for this instance for SSH, I see that he's done public key authentication, and this is a client trusted server, meaning that he's visited this server before. So I don't have to worry too much about it. But this KS is what is interesting. KS for us in Corelight stands for keyboard strokes, meaning that this was an interactive session. So he's not normally accessing this 61 according to my IPAM and my data, my asset management database. It seems like he usually doesn't access this thing, but he does have it because he's in the admin group. So that's interesting, but he's gone active and we need to investigate a little bit further. His second SSH session that happened later though, is going to that same 61, which he didn't really have access to. But as I'm looking through it, he's done the public key authentication. It's that same cluster triad server. It's auto-negotiated. But this LFD, this is interesting because it looks like he's doing large file downloads, which isn't normal for a sysadmin to start taking data from a server. I could understand him pushing data, by uploading files, maybe, packages, maybe things that he needs to, tools that he has to have, but downloading is not good. And what this means to me potentially is that I'm going to write in my ticket that he's done a large file download, check his outgoing connections for anything that looks similar in size-wise for this large file download, because maybe he's prepositioning. And what I mean by prepositioning is because it looks like he might be prepositioning for data exfil, because his abnormal traffic, the interpreter, all these things with PowerShell Empire seem to point to bad actor, whether it is him or not. So I'm going to go and see other things now. I knew that he has SMB, and I want to see some interesting SMB traffic. So I'm going to do a quick check. I want to see if SMB has been going outbound from my network, and I want to see potentially if it's related to our guy, Edward. And so with this, I see two. I see a .13 going out to this. So maybe this is another IP address that my tier 2 has to analyze, but I'm going to focus on this tier 1. So I'm going to focus and look at all these events that are related to him. And what's interesting is that I get 2 events that are related to conlog and to conlog. And it looks like SMB is occurring. So maybe I need to start looking at what this UID is doing as well. So let's pivot to the other logs. And so I see that I have 5 source types. I have SMB files and SMB mappings. So let's look at SMB mappings first. I want to see what he's actually touched on this network, what he's mapped to. And this is interesting. Remember we saw that clickme.phishing domain? It looked like it was occurring in DNS. So it looks like it's actually being generated because of this. So it looks like he put in a path to clickme.phishing to map, and it mapped externally. So it actually mapped to a drive that's hosted in the internet. And what's interesting now is that as I'm going through this, maybe there's other interesting things that are occurring with this. So I'm going to look at stuff that are related to his mappings, because now I want to see potentially what he's talked to and restrict it to his IP address. So I'm going to look at rare paths, and I see that clickme.phishing, it's occurred those 5 times. I'm going to view those events and see what's happening. And on this, we saw the mappings log, but now we see SMB files. And what SMB files says is that based off of the mapping we saw in mapping, they were accessing a resource on that network drive that's remote outside of the internet, to the internet, by the way, for something called mimispool.dll. And it looks like they were also doing something with mimikatz.exe. So I'm going to take this information and I'm going to apply it to my ticket. And we still have that UID, so I'm going to apply the UIDs as well. Next, I know that since it occurred in SMB files and these accesses, I'm going to look at potentially something else. So let's take those 2 names. We knew that the file names were mimispool.dll and as well as mimikatz.exe. I'm going to do a quick search on the files log, and I'm going to see what pulls up. So I see 2 events, and it seems like that mimispool.dll that we saw before, that traversed based off of those con UIDs that we saw, is actually a potential DOS executable. So even though it's a DLL, it might be an exe. And usually DLLs did dynamic link library, so I don't know what that is. I'm going to have to ask my tier 2 to investigate these files. And then the same thing happened. It looks like it was attempted twice. So now that I have all of this information in my ticket, I'm going to submit it to my tier 2 Skylar. And with that, I'm going to let Skylar take over.
Thanks, Chit. I'll be taking over as the tier 2 analyst and threat hunter for this case. Using the evidence that Chit has provided, we know that the suspected adversary likely used PowerShell in this attack. The first step in this case would be to see if we can locate that PowerShell. And for that, let's pivot to the Hunter threat hunting content library. Hunter was developed to provide a continuously growing catalog of threat hunting content to detect the latest adversary techniques, exploits, and malware. Our packages deliver the latest threat hunting queries, analyst-focused runbooks, remediations, as well as validation packages. Hunter provides every analyst with a list of the top most useful threat hunting content packages. In this case, we are looking for suspicious PowerShell activity. One of the most common techniques used is encoded PowerShell commands. This is one of our most common packages and is visible on the front page. So let's quickly take a look at the PowerShell encoded command package. Front and center into every package is the content in a growing number of different formats. But we know that threat hunting content is more than just the query, it's the context. So you can see below the content, there's an easily digestible threat description that allows you to identify the threat, its target, its dependencies, mapping to MITRE, diamond model, and kill chain. Below that, you will see the raw query logic, which allows it to be very easily ported to other platforms and tools that are not currently supported. It also includes additional research, references, runbooks, and mitigations. But let's jump back up to the content and grab a query for Splunk. You can either copy and paste or deploy this query in tool. And we're going to limit this search to the host that our tier 1 analyst has identified, as well as change our time window to when the attack occurred. And very quickly from this query, we were able to quickly locate the adversary's encoded PowerShell command. Looking into this log, which seems to have occurred multiple times, we can see that security ID is S1518. This does not correspond to a normal user, but to the NT Authority system account, a built-in Windows account that the operating system uses to do low-level operations for critical function, unencumbered by security policy. This provides the process the highest amount of privilege as possible, and how this was achieved is still unknown, and we will investigate that later. But first, let's look exactly into what this PowerShell is doing by dropping it into CyberChef and decoding. By unbase64ing it, and we can see the periods that we also need to decode the text. This is very obfuscated and hard to read, but we can see down near the middle that we are creating a new object web client with what appears to be a user agent to pretend to be Mozilla Firefox, building what looks to be a URL, as well as some additional base64. If we again decode this base64, we get this URL out. This URL matches the IP that Chit has provided us, and we can deem that this is in fact malicious. What's a little odd about this is that humans don't normally type an IP in a URL like this. Humans tend to prefer a domain name, something easily remember. This can usually be indicative of malware, scripts, or other automated non-human means. CyberChef does provide a regular expression to match IP addresses. And we can take this and turn it into a query to find this type of activity. And we can see our events filtering out the local IPs that we know are safe after checking the network map. We can see the only other things matched. Well, there's a lot of logs just pushing it to the bottom, but I did see them in there. Going back to our PowerShell command, which I believe was this window. we can confirm this is the PowerShell Empire plant, and the URL and IP address match what was flagged by Chit. Let's follow the process chain down to see what this process is spawning. Focusing on this new process ID. And changing new to creator, we can jump one step down the chain and see everything that this process created. Unfortunately, searching across 7 days of data can take a few moments. And here we can see that this process was spawning meter.exe in the system32 folder, which after a quick bit of Googling does not exist natively and was probably planted there, as well as creating a scheduled task to run as system at 10:30 a.m. on Halloween to call conti.exe, which is also not there natively. It also names itself as updater in an attempt to hide. The attacker made no attempts to obscure the names of the files, so we can assume that these may be Meterpreter, as well as the Conti ransomware. However, if the attacker had tried to mask the names, we would not know this, but pulling the files from the infected host, we could confirm this. Now, pretending for a moment that we missed all of the above and knew nothing of the attack to come, we can also find this exact scheduled task using another Hunter package. Let's pivot back to the Hunter platform and get a package related to scheduled tasks. Typing scheduled in the bar. We can see some profiles for well-known attackers known to use scheduled tasks, as well as several packages related. Let's just grab this one. Deploying in Splunk. And again, changing our time frame to when the attack occurred. Creating scheduled tasks is a very common technique used by numerous threat actors and malware strains, and is another great point of entry into this investigation had we known nothing about it. It's also a very common technique for non-malicious means, and we will see several logs appearing that do not warrant investigation. Such as these ones. But giving it a little more time, our scheduled task should appear. And there it is. This makes another great entry point into this investigation had we seen nothing else. And rather than working forward from the PowerShell to find the scheduled task, we could work backwards to find our PowerShell from here. I'm going to stop this. Jumping back to our PowerShell, we worked down the process chain to find what process the PowerShell Empire implant called, but we still don't know where it came from. Let's go the opposite direction and determine where it came from. Changing this back to new. We should get one log. Although it seems we do have some ID reuse. Yeah, this one's PowerShell. So we can see it was created by cmd.exe, and focusing on this ID. And again, changing creator to new, we can jump one more step up the chain to see where this command prompt came from. and we can see this command prompt was spawned by spoolsv. Spoolsv is the Windows print spooler and handles everything related to printing, including the installation of printer drivers. Calling CMD is not inherently malicious and does happen occasionally, but those CMDs should not be calling malware, which makes it worth investigating. Chit did mention seeing mimikatz and mimispool.dll, and a quick Google search of mimispool will reveal that it is Mimikatz' relatively new print nightmare exploit that ships with Mimikatz. While Windows Event Log can log file creation and access events, many of these events are disabled by default because of how many logs they create, and we don't necessarily recommend enabling them. Threat hunting is about finding a needle in the haystack, and creating too many logs can create more hay than needles. However, as a personal choice, we have enabled sysmon logging so that we can look for either event 11 file creations or event 7 DLL loaded to find the DLL that Chit has mentioned. It seems like I missed an I. So here we can see mimispool.dll is being created under the print drivers folder in system32. If the attacker had been smart enough to rename the DLL, as with all other files in this attack, we may not be able to Google it or find out what it is. However, we do know that a DLL was transferred over the network from a remote share from a known malicious IP, installed as a printer driver, and then soon after spoolsv launched a command prompt. This is very clearly malicious. Mimispool is a part of Mimikatz, and if the mimispool.dll was loaded, then Mimikatz must have run, which Chit also mentioned seeing. Let's try to find that. Searching just for execution events. And again, waiting as we process a week's worth of data. We can see one execution event for mimikatz.exe. It was spawned by cmd.exe, and we can see the security ID does map to a user and is of a much longer form than the previous one. Checking the domain controller, we can map this security ID to the user Evil Insider, and we can conclude that Edward was complicit in this attack and helped the attacker gain a foothold into the network. And I'll throw it back over to Chit.
Thanks, Skylar. And the last thing that I wanted to show going back was, since my tier 2 did mention that Meterpreter was spawned, I could use that unique identifier again inside of Meterpreter to look at conlog to see what he actually did with Meterpreter. So I'm going to go back and I'm just going to look at this real quick to quickly identify how much data was going in or out of my network with this. So with this traffic, I'm actually seeing bytes go in and bytes go out, meaning that there is data and it looks like it was used to pull that SSH down. So let's recap this. So what happened? Evil Insider had talked out to our guys at DarkFuzz over Discord. There, we didn't see the SSH private key being used potentially over Discord to be sent to him, but we did notice that the SSH private key that he did send to them was used in the attack in some form or fashion. What ends up happening is that we saw that Evil Insider's user ID was being used to use Mimikatz and Mimispool, which was the print nightmare exploit. That gave them access to the Acme Court systems, which actually spawned up PowerShell Empire, as our tier 2 Skylar noticed. And what that provided them was a way back to their infrastructure so that they could actually implant something like Meterpreter, as we saw with meter.exe. And from there, the network guys saw that there was recon activity. There was a little bit of scanning that was occurring inside Meterpreter from that .12. And then from the recon activity, we saw SSH private key being used that was Evil Insiders to use his domain creds to access computers. And what we saw was a large file download. And then shortly after, we saw that a scheduled task was used for Conti's ransomware. And then after that, all that data that was exfiltrated to that computer was pushed outbound via Meterpreter back to the dark fuzz game. And so as we recap this in individual pieces, what is hunting the adversary? Well, we saw two sides. We saw the host logs, including the EDR solution, as well as the network data from Zeek and from Corelight. So as we start drawing this down, the report to the CISO goes like this. We saw that PuTTY was launched because as we investigated further about the SSH keys being used, we saw that PuTTY was launched and actually the keys were extracted from PuTTY. We saw that Chrome was launched, which was used for the communication to Discord. And then later on, we saw that CMD.exe was launched and that net use commands were used to do some network mapping. The command.exe also launched, which ended up creating the PowerShell Empire piece, which then was used to apply Mimikatz. And then a payload was launched, which was the mimispool.dll. From the network side, we saw DNS queries for discord.com. And we actually saw the HTTP traffic, which was indicative in the SSL log for discord.com, as well as discord.gg. Inside of DNS query, we also saw that there was a clickme.phishing as well as SMB mappings for clickme.phishing to a folder called Mimi. And from there, in the SMB traffic, as we linked those together, we saw the mappings to it. We saw the installation of the print driver via the mappings and the open commands in SMB traffic. In there, we identified that it was potentially an implant because of the files. And then as we traversed through some of the different logs that we saw with Evil Insider's computer, we saw that SSH keystrokes are being used, as well as an SSH large file download. And then we saw from the Meterpreter side that that file download was actually pushed out via that session. What that means is that when we're doing threat hunting, it's a combination of both. Each side has to tell a story. Each side has to tell you what's going on, because with one or the other, you only get half the story. So I wanted to pivot into Q&A now. And Josh, do we have any questions or anything related in the chat?
Sure, Chad. Yeah, we have a couple of questions already. The first question is related to what you mentioned in Corelight with the large file downloads. So you had showed LFD for downloads, and then you had mentioned something about uploads. Is that what LFU would stand for?
That is correct. Yeah, LFU would tell you large file uploads, but we also do some really cool things that if it was a smaller potential file, we could say SMU for small file uploads, or SFU.
Perfect. And Francis would like to know, you had mentioned initially about the input framework in Corelight. What exactly is that?
So input framework, when I showed it in my section, is a place where you can actually tag data inside Corelight, meaning that if you had arbitrary data that identified host IP addresses belonging to an organization, you could put that in there. So meaning that you could use IPAM or a CMDB, a content management database for assets. You could actually push that to a file inside Corelight and then use that to tag the data.
And John wants to know, so you had mentioned Suricata early on. How does Suricata logs have a UID now?
So that's actually very interesting. So the way that Suricata works inside Corelight is instead of assigning worker processes and Suricata worker processes to individual cores, we can actually run them simultaneously on a single core. And what that means is that they both see the same traffic. So there is no picking or choosing, who gets what resources. They both get really the same resources, but the Suricata alert actually goes back into the Zeek framework and then tag that data with the UID.
Okay, and Suraj would like to know, what is currently the highest throughput on a single Corelight sensor?
So That's great to ask. So we have hardware and virtual. The greatest throughput through one of our hardware sensors is 100 gigabits per second on a single U platform. We have a guy that is from the open source community that works at Corelight named Vince Stouffer, who at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, it took like racks and racks to do 100 gigs of Zeek.
And another quick question for you, Chit, related to Corelight at home. So just out of curiosity, Jeff would like to know, does the at-home version require a Pi 4 or can you get away with a 3?
We've actually had people who've been able to deploy it on a 3. The Pi 4s just tend to have a little bit beefier hardware. It really just depends on how much traffic you're trying to push. Usually for a home network traffic, which is what the Corelight at home piece is for, you can go with less. I've actually tried to deploy it on my an ARM device outside of a Pi, and it still works.
Awesome. And we have a question from Dennis for Skylar. He wanted to know, so why would Evil Insider open up a command just to run, like a command prompt rather, just to run Mimikatz, just to get a new command for PowerShell? Why not just run the PowerShell directly?
So you could run PowerShell directly, but by going through Mimikatz first, the new command prompt gets system privileges. And that means that your PowerShell command runs and will be less inhibited by security policy down the road.
Awesome. And that's everything we have right now, Chit.
Well, thanks, Josh. So I'm guessing we're going to be going to the next slides just to kind of close it out. If there are no questions, and I'm glad to take more after the fact. So if you like what you saw today and you would like to try Hunter out for yourself, you can head over to the link below and use the promo code, the callback, for a free community edition account where you can access dozens of the ones that Skylar showed. You can access dozens of those behavioral threat hunting content packages, as well as a hunting content for the latest exploits, malware, and adversary techniques. So that is what Skylar showed you today, which is a great platform. And I love it because as an analyst, it would have definitely helped me early on in my career. If you want, sign up at the bottom using the link below, this Hunt with Cyber Hunter, and use that promo code, the callback, when you sign up, and you can get that free community edition account. And for Corelight, if you enjoyed today's Hunt tutorial and would like to try it on your home network, well, you're in luck. We have that Corelight at Home program. So it's a fun, free, lightweight version of the same network evidence that we showed today, so that you can hunt from your own network. You can throw it into Splunk, you can throw it into Elastic, you can throw it to Humio, you can throw it into everything you want, even on disk. Because when you're looking at this, the callback might literally be coming from inside your house, from your television set or an IoT vacuum talking back to Shenzhen's China. I know I do because I have a lot of TCL, cheap TVs in my house. So we do regular webinar series that feature the Hunt at Home finding stuff. So if you want to do that, you could also sign up for some of those webinars because we give really cool prizes away like 3D printers. So if you sign up, please sign up at the URL below here at gocorelight.com, Corelight at Home. And then don't forget to follow us on social media to check out for some of our other content, including threat hunting deep dives, walkthroughs, free detection content, and much, much more. We'll be announcing future webinars via the channels, so keep your eye on that. We appreciate the time that you let us borrow from your busy lives and hope you have a great rest of your week. Thank you.